Hey everybody, this is Pat from Feed Your Brain. As we saw in our previous video, the French tried to establish a colony in Brazil. It didn't work out as they planned. So what do you do when you fail to colonize Brazil? What's your plan B? Well, the answer is very simple. Florida! Despite the failure of the Brazilian colony, Amiral Gaspard de Coligny succeeded in convincing King Charles IX of the importance of a French colony in America. He argued that the great wealth of the New World could not be left to Spain and Portugal, and that it was imperative to establish French colonies. In 1562, Coligny chose one of the best navigators in France, Jean Ribaut, a native of Dieppe, and appointed him to lead a new expedition. René de Laudonnière, who was Amiral Coligny's assistant, was named second in command. Ribaut reached the Florida coast on April 30, 1562. He sailed north to the St. Johns River near present-day Jacksonville. The French erected a column on which they placed the coat of arms of Queen Catherine. They met the local natives, the Timucuas, and relations were very friendly. Then, contravening the orders of Coligny, who had prohibited any construction on this first trip, Ribaut went to Paris Island, near the present city of Port Royal in South Carolina, and built a small fort which he named Charlefort. He left Captain Pierrat in charge of 30 soldiers and set sail for Europe. Back in France, religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants were raging. Ribaut discovered that his hometown, Dieppe, was besieged by Catholics. So he went to England, where he spoke to Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant like him, and asked her to come to the help of Charlefort. When he realized that England was actually planning to take Florida for itself, he tried to escape the country, but was captured and thrown into the Tower of London. Yeah, back then in England, anybody that the Queen didn't like ended up in the Tower of London. Frankly, it was probably the place to be. Everybody who's anybody was in that damn tower. Meanwhile, at Charlefort, the isolation and the waiting became more and more unbearable. Captain Pierrat was killed after a mutiny, and the men decided to return to France on their own. They built a shabby rowboat of wood, vines, and moss, used native blankets for sails, and attempted to return to Europe. Only one Frenchman, a 17-year-old young man named Guillaume Rouffy, decided to stay in America and try his luck with the natives. He was found and interrogated by the Spanish in 1564, and the result of this meeting will be touched upon in our next video. Meanwhile, on the open sea, the men attempting to reach Europe on their shabby boat found themselves isolated and motionless in the middle of the Atlantic for 21 days. The men survived for a while by eating their clothes and by drinking their urine. Getting more and more desperate, they then decided that it was better for one man to die than the whole group. A man named Lachaire was then killed and devoured by his companions. This boat of horrors was finally discovered by an English ship which came to its aid. The occupants were on the verge of death. Back in England, the expedition leader, Nicolas Barré, was questioned by the Queen of England before being thrown into the Tower of London. That same year, back in Florida, Guillaume Rouffy led the Spanish to the abandoned Charlefort, which was immediately burned. The Spaniards then returned to Cuba, convinced that they had just wiped out the French presence in Florida once and for all. What they did not know was that René de Laudonnière, appointed to lead a second expedition, arrived on the coast of Florida a few days later. This expedition of 4 women and 300 men arrived in 1564 on the bank of the St. Johns River. They built a new fortified settlement there, which they named Fort Caroline. Among them was Jacques Lemoine de Morgue, the first important painter in the history of North America. During the first winter, the threat of famine became more and more real. A group of rebels plotted against Laudonnière, but they were discovered before carrying out their plan. 13 rebels then seized the boat and fled to Cuba. This is how the Spanish authorities learned that the French were back in Florida. After a long isolation, the colony was in poor condition when the English captain, John Hawkins, stopped there and shared his food reserves with the colonists. Laudonnière exchanged several of his guns and part of his powder reserves for one of Hawkins' ships, which he intended to use to return to France. But before embarking, to everyone's surprise, Jean Ribault arrived at the head of a fleet of 7 ships carrying 600 people, food, and weapons. He had been released from his London prison and sent by the French authorities to come to the aid of the small Florida colony. Furious to learn that the French were back in Florida, the King of Spain ordered one of his most competent captains, Pedro Menendez de Aviles, to expel the French at all costs. In 1565, Menendez reached the mouth of the St. Johns River. Ribault's ships blocked the entrance to the river and forced the Spanish to retreat to the south. The Spaniards landed at a place they considered strategic and built fortifications which they called San Agustin, the present city of Saint Augustine. Today it is the oldest permanently inhabited European settlement in the history of continental North America. Ribault decided to take the initiative and to attack the Spaniards while they were busy settling down. Unfortunately for him, his ships were caught in a sudden tropical storm which pushed them beyond the Spanish fortifications. Most of the French ships sank near present-day Daytona Beach. The wreckage of one of these ships was found at a depth of 8 meters in 2016. The royal coat of arms on 3 bronze cannons and a marker stone decorated with fleurs-de-lys made it possible for marine archaeologists to identify it as one of Ribault's ships. After the French failed attempt, Menendez decided to mount his own surprise attack. He set off at the head of 500 soldiers to attack Fort Caroline. The attack on the fort was a success. Menendez's professional soldiers easily overcame the French garrison, mainly made up of men with no military experience. In only an hour, 145 Frenchmen were killed, while only 1 Spaniard lost his life. The fort was renamed San Mateo. Laudonnière and artist Jacques Lemoine, whose drawings and paintings remain an important source of information on the indigenous peoples of the time, fled back to France with 45 survivors. Ribault's forces, stranded on the beaches of Daytona, had no choice but to march north and besiege San Agustin. They might have been able to succeed, but they found themselves trapped, unable to cross a river due to a lack of tools and wood. It was there, on September 29, 1565, that Menendez found the approximately 200 exhausted Frenchmen who immediately capitulated. Several wealthy French people offered Menendez to buy their freedom, but he refused. The French were taken prisoner. The following October 12, the Spanish tied their hands behind their backs, and then, in groups of 10, they made them cross the river, led them behind a sand dune out of sight of their companions, and massacred them with knives and swords. When Ribault's turn came and he found himself face to face with Menendez, it is said that he offered him a generous ransom for his freedom. The Spaniard refused, after which Ribault reportedly declared his pride in being a Lutheran before being stabbed to death. Only a dozen French people were spared after declaring that they were Catholic. Since that horrific event, the place has been called Matanzas Inlet, which means Massacre Cove. Thus ended, in this despicable bloodbath, the French adventure in Florida. Today, Matanzas Inlet is a national monument. In Jacksonville, the reproduction of a French marker named the Ribault Monument commemorates these events. Another monument in Ribault's memory was erected in the Timucuan Ecological and Historical Preserve overlooking St. John's River. 2 schools have been named after Ribault, as was a ride in an amusement park. In 2018, the shipwreck of one of the French boats called La Trinité was located off the coast of Cape Canaveral in Florida. And thus ends the French adventure in Florida, if you don't count the thousands of Québécois who are going there every winter to go away on vacation away from the snow. If we don't count these guys, then that's pretty much the end of the French presence in Florida. It's a pretty horrible end, but what a story. What an amazing story. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you did, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and on that note, I say to you, au revoir and see you soon.